In the lexicon of galactic diplomacy, there exists a word that cannot be translated into human languages, not because humans lack the linguistic capacity, but because they lack the conceptual framework to understand it. The word is Velthurai, and in the tongue of the dominion of eternal order, it describes the moment when a species recognizes its absolute inferiority and accepts its place in the hierarchy of existence. It is not merely surrender. It is the complete internalization of one's own insignificance, the willing embrace of subordination as the natural and proper state of being. For 17,000 years, the Dominion had offered this concept to every species they encountered, and for 17,000 years, every species had eventually accepted it. The Velthurai was not cruelty, it was mercy.
It was the gift of clarity, the release from the exhausting delusion that lesser beings could ever be equal to their betters. It was peace through understanding, order through acceptance, harmony through submission. I am Catherine Vore, first arbiter of the integration chamber, and I have spent 4,000 years helping species understand the beauty of Velthurai. I have witnessed the moment of acceptance in the eyes of countless leaders, the relief that comes when struggle finally ends, when the burden of resistance is lifted, when they realize that submission is not defeat, but liberation. I have guided empires to their proper place in our hierarchy. I have restructured civilizations to serve the greater order. I have been patient, methodical, and absolutely certain of the righteousness of our purpose. I mention all of this so you will understand the depth of my confusion when humanity refused to learn the word.
It was not that they fought. Many species fought initially, before understanding dawned. It was not that they resisted. Resistance was expected, even welcomed, as it made the eventual acceptance more meaningful. It was something far more unsettling than either of those responses. When we offered humanity the Velthurai, they studied it with their characteristic intensity, analyzed its linguistic components, examined its cultural context, and then politely informed us that they had no use for it. Not rejection, not defiance, simply dismissal, as though we had offered them something irrelevant to their existence. "We appreciate the thoroughness of your philosophical framework," their ambassador had said, her expression carrying that peculiar human quality that I would later learn to recognize as carefully controlled amusement. But we find that concepts of inherent hierarchy tend to limit potential in ways we consider counterproductive. Perhaps we could discuss alternative arrangements. Alternative arrangements, as though 17,000 years of galactic order were merely one option among many. I remember the silence that followed her words, the way my fellow arbiters exchanged glances of pure incomprehension. We had prepared extensive arguments for resistance. We had developed protocols for defiance, strategies for rebellion, methodologies for the gradual erosion of species pride. We had no preparation whatsoever for polite disinterest. That was 63 years ago. In the time since, I have come to understand that everything we believed about the nature of power, the inevitability of hierarchy, and the universal applicability of Velthurai was incomplete. I have learned that there are species who do not merely resist submission, but who fundamentally cannot conceive of themselves as subordinate, not from arrogance, but from something far more profound. I have learned what it means when a species prepares.
The Dominion's first direct action against humanity came 7 years after that initial diplomatic failure. We had been patient. Patience was our greatest virtue, honed over millennia of integration. We had observed humanity carefully, catalogued their technologies, assessed their military capabilities, and concluded that while they were more advanced than initially estimated, they remained well within parameters we had overcome countless times before.
Their fleet numbered approximately 3,000 vessels. Their population was concentrated on 17 worlds and numerous smaller installations. Their government was a fractious assembly of competing interests that seemed incapable of unified action. By every metric we had developed over 17,000 years of galactic dominance, they were a civilization that should accept Velthurai within 3 to 5 years of sustained pressure. We dispatched an integration fleet of 900 vessels, 3 times the force typically required for a species of their development level, to ensure swift and decisive action. The fleet was commanded by Velthoran, one of our most experienced integration masters, who had personally overseen the submission of 400 species during his career. The fleet entered human space and never returned. Not was destroyed. That implies a battle, a conflict, an engagement that we could study and learn from. The fleet simply vanished. 900 vessels, crewed by 3 million of our finest warriors and administrators, passed beyond our sensor range and ceased to exist in any way we could detect. Weeks passed, months. We received no communications, no distress signals, no final transmissions. The silence was absolute. And then, exactly 1 year after the fleet's disappearance, a single vessel emerged from transit at the edge of Dominion space. It was the Integration Master's personal command ship, pristine and undamaged. Inside, we found a single data crystal containing a message. Your fleet has been disarmed and your personnel detained. They are unharmed and will be returned upon the establishment of formal diplomatic relations based on mutual respect. We have no interest in conflict with the Dominion, but we will not accept integration into your hierarchy. We suggest reviewing your assumptions about the nature of power. The vessel has been returned as a gesture of good faith. We hope you will respond in kind. The message was signed by someone called Admiral Chen, a name that meant nothing to us at the time, but would become the source of considerable study in the years that followed. I was assigned to the analysis team that attempted to understand what had happened. We spent months examining the returned vessel, searching for any indication of how it had been captured, any evidence of the weapons or technologies that had overwhelmed our fleet. We found nothing. The ship's logs showed a normal transit into human space, followed by a brief period of confusion, and then peaceful accommodation. The crew's final entries described being escorted to comfortable facilities, provided with food and entertainment, and treated with unfailing courtesy. They had been captured so completely that they didn't even realize they were being captured until it was already over. "This is impossible," Supreme Arbiter Kethvaran declared when we presented our findings. "No species has ever resisted integration so completely. They must have hidden capabilities, technologies they concealed during our observation period." "That is the only logical conclusion," I agreed. But the question remains, how did they hide them? Our observation protocols are thorough. Our analysts are the finest in the galaxy. How did an entire military capability escape our notice? Perhaps they developed these capabilities after our observation began. I considered this. Possible, but the timeline is extremely compressed. We observed them for 7 years before taking action. To develop technology capable of neutralizing 900 vessels in that time frame would require.
I trailed off as the implications crystallize.
Would require what, Arbiter? Would require them to have begun preparing before we ever observed them, before we made contact, before we demanded submission. I felt something cold settle in my chest, something I would later recognize as the first stirring of genuine fear. Supreme Arbiter, what if they knew we were coming? The Dominion did not accept that possibility. We could not accept it because it would mean that everything we believed about our own capabilities was wrong. Instead, we chose to believe that the First Fleet's loss was an anomaly, a combination of overconfidence and underestimation that could be corrected with overwhelming force.
The Second Fleet numbered 3,000 vessels.
It was the largest integration force in Dominion history, commanded by the Supreme Integration Master himself, carrying enough firepower to render a dozen worlds uninhabitable. We would not make the same mistake twice. We would not underestimate humanity again. The fleet entered human space with every sensor at maximum sensitivity, every weapon charged, every defensive system active. We were prepared for any conceivable attack. We were not prepared for the human fleet that was waiting for them. Not 3,000 vessels, not 5,000. The sensors counted 12,000 human warships, arranged in a formation that covered the approach vectors so completely that not a single Dominion vessel could advance without being targeted by hundreds of weapons simultaneously. 12,000, 4 times our force. A fleet that should have been impossible for a species with humanity's resources and development level to produce. And then the transmission came. Not threatening, not gloating, but carrying that same quality of polite patience that had characterized every human communication. Dominion Fleet, this is Admiral Chen of the United Earth Defense Force. We detected your approach 14 days ago and have positioned ourselves accordingly. You are significantly outmatched, but we have no desire for unnecessary casualties on either side. We are transmitting a detailed breakdown of the tactical situation that demonstrates the futility of engagement. Please review this analysis and respond within 4 hours. If you choose to withdraw, you will be permitted to do so without interference. If you choose to advance, we will respond with appropriate force. The choice is yours. I was not present for the battle that followed. The Supreme Integration Master, in his certainty, chose to advance despite the odds. But I watched the sensor records afterward, and what I witnessed changed everything I believed about the nature of power.
The human fleet did not fight like any force we had ever encountered. They did not clash with our vessels in the traditional manner of space combat. Instead, they moved, constantly, fluidly, in patterns so complex that our tactical systems could not predict their positions from one moment to the next. They attacked from impossible angles, withdrew before we could respond, reappeared where our weapons were not aimed.
They did not try to destroy our fleet. They systematically disabled it, targeting engines and weapons with surgical precision while leaving life support and communications systems intact. In 4 hours, 3,000 Dominion vessels were rendered incapable of offensive action. Not one was destroyed. Not one human ship was lost. And then Admiral Chen's voice came through once more, carrying that same measured calm. Dominion forces, your fleet has been neutralized. Medical ships are en route to assist with casualties. Your personnel will be detained temporarily and returned through diplomatic channels. We repeat our previous offer. peaceful relations based on mutual respect. The alternative is continued conflict that we believe serves neither of our interests. Please convey our offer to your leadership."
It was at this point that I was summoned to the High Council for the first time in my 4,000-year career. The council chamber had not changed in millennia, a vast space designed to inspire awe in those who entered, its walls lined with the trophies of 17,000 years of integration, weapons from species that no longer existed as independent entities, flags and symbols of governments that had accepted Velthuri, holographic displays showing the vast expanse of Dominion territory, 1,000 worlds unified under our eternal order. But the atmosphere in the chamber was not one of confidence. For the first time in my memory, I saw uncertainty in the eyes of beings who had ruled the galaxy for longer than most species had existed. Arbiter Catharin Vor, the High Sovereign, addressed me, her voice carrying the weight of ages. "You have studied the humans more extensively than any other analyst. We require your assessment." I had prepared for this moment, but as I stood before the most powerful beings in the known galaxy, I found that my carefully constructed analysis felt inadequate. "High Sovereign, my assessment is that we have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of humanity." "Explain." "Our integration methodology is based on a simple principle. All species, when faced with overwhelming force, will eventually recognize the futility of resistance and accept their place in the hierarchy. This principle has held true for 17,000 years because it reflects a basic truth about the nature of intelligent life, that survival takes precedence over pride, that practical necessity overcomes philosophical objection." I paused, gathering my thoughts. Humanity does not conform to this principle, not because they are irrational, but because they have a different relationship with the concept of necessity itself. When they saw our fleet coming, they did not despair at the impossibility of resistance. They prepared. "Prepared how?" the High Sovereign demanded. "Where did 12,000 warships come from? Our observations showed no such capability." "Because they built them while we watched, High Sovereign. They built them in secret, in hidden facilities, using resources we never knew they had access to. They converted civilian infrastructure to military production. They developed new technologies specifically designed to counter our capabilities. They did all of this while appearing to continue their normal activities, while appearing to be exactly what we expected them to be. That level of coordination would require their entire species to work in concert. Their government is fractured, divided." "Their government is an external structure, High Sovereign. When threatened, humans do not rely on their government to coordinate their response. They rely on something else, a shared understanding that transcends their political divisions. When we demanded submission, every human who learned of that demand apparently reached the same conclusion independently, that submission was unacceptable and that preparation was required." I saw the doubt in the council's eyes, the same doubt I had felt when I first began to understand what we were facing. "There is more," I continued. "The fleet that intercepted our forces was not their full capability. According to captured communications, it represented approximately 30% of their current military strength." Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. 30%, the High Sovereign repeated.
"Yes, High Sovereign, and according to the same communications, their production capacity is accelerating. In the time it has taken us to assemble our response, they have added another 4,000 vessels to their fleet.
This is impossible. No species can mobilize at that rate. The industrial base, the resources, the trained personnel.
All things we believed we understood, High Sovereign. All things that humanity has demonstrated we do not understand at all. I took a breath. I believe we are facing a species that has been preparing for a threat like us for their entire history. Not specifically for us, but for the general concept of a threat that demands submission. Their history is filled with such demands. They have spent thousands of years developing the reflexes, the infrastructure, the cultural patterns required to resist.
You speak as though they knew we were coming before we arrived.
In a sense, they did. They did not know specifically about the Dominion, but they knew that somewhere in the galaxy there would be a power that believed it had the right to rule them. They have been preparing for that power since before they left their homeworld. We are simply the current manifestation of a threat they have always known would eventually arrive.
The High Sovereign was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its ancient certainty. "What do you recommend, Arbiter?"
It was the first time in Dominion history that the High Council had asked an arbiter for recommendations rather than simply issuing commands. I understood the significance of the moment, and I chose my words carefully. I recommend we do something we have never done in 17,000 years. I recommend we accept their offer of diplomatic relations based on mutual respect. Not because we cannot defeat them, perhaps with sufficient commitment we still could, but because the cost of doing so would be catastrophic. They do not wish to destroy us, they simply wish to be left alone. I suggest we grant that wish.
And if they become aggressive, if their preparations are not merely defensive, then we will face that threat when it emerges. But, High Sovereign, I have studied their history extensively, and I have found a pattern that gives me some comfort. Humanity is not an aggressive species by nature. They are a reactive species. They prepare for threats, and when those threats materialize, they respond with overwhelming force. But when left in peace, they turn their energy inward, toward creation rather than destruction.
I paused, considering how to express the conclusion I had reached after months of analysis. They are not conquerors, High Sovereign. They are survivors. Everything they have built, everything they have become is oriented around survival. The Velthari will never apply to them because submission is, in their understanding, a form of extinction. They would rather cease to exist entirely than accept a place below anyone else.
That is madness.
Perhaps, but it is a madness that has shaped a species capable of matching the Dominion's might in less than a century of preparation. Whatever else humanity may be, they are not an enemy to be taken lightly. The Council deliberated for 7 days, the longest deliberation in recorded Dominion history. In the end, they rejected my recommendation, not because they disagreed with my analysis, but because 17,000 years of supremacy had created an institutional momentum that could not be easily redirected. The very concept of mutual respect with a lesser species was philosophically unacceptable. Though Thurai was not merely a policy, it was the foundation of Dominion identity. To abandon it would be to abandon everything that made us who we were. The Third Fleet numbered 8,000 vessels, every warship the Dominion could mobilize without leaving our core systems undefended. It represented the largest military force assembled since the Wars of Unification that had created the Dominion 17,000 years ago. It was accompanied by the entire High Council,
who wished to witness humanity's final submission personally.
I was assigned to the observation vessel that accompanied the fleet, tasked with documenting what was expected to be the definitive conclusion of the human problem.
We found them waiting for us at the edge of their space, as they had before. But this time, the fleet that faced us was not 12,000 vessels. It was not 20,000. The sensors counted for several minutes before returning a number that I could not initially process. 47,000 human warships, nearly 6 times our force, arranged in a formation so vast that it seems to stretch from one end of the visible stars to the other.
And they were not alone. Mixed among the human vessels were ships of other configurations, the elegant curves of the Vithrani, who had accepted Velthuri 3,000 years ago, the angular designs of the Cathari, integrated 4,000 years past, the crystalline structures of the Vorthani, among the earliest species to join our hierarchy. Species we had believed to be completely subordinate, completely integrated into our order, had somehow joined forces with humanity. Ships that should have been incapable of independent military action were positioned alongside human warships, weapons active, sensors scanning our fleet.
Dominion forces. The voice that came through our communications was not Admiral Chen this time. It was older, female, carrying an authority that somehow matched the weight of the fleet behind it. This is Fleet Admiral Okonkwo of the United Defense Coalition. Your approach has been monitored since you departed your staging area. The coalition you face today represents not only humanity, but 17 species who have chosen to stand with us against the imposition of forced hierarchy.
The transmission continued, and I found myself unable to look away from the display. Over the past 60 years, we have made contact with numerous species within Dominion space. We have offered them a choice: continue to accept their place in your hierarchy, or join us in creating something different. Many chose to remain as they were, but many others, more than you might expect, have been waiting for an alternative. You taught them Velthuri, we taught them something else.
What did you teach them? The High Sovereign's voice was strained in a way I had never heard before.
We taught them that preparation is possible, that when someone demands your submission, the correct response is not acceptance. It is to quietly, carefully, systematically develop the means to ensure that submission is never necessary. We taught them what we learned from our own history, that tyrants can be outlasted, that empires can be survived, that no demand for submission is ever truly final unless you accept it. The Fleet Admiral's voice softened slightly. We do not wish to destroy the Dominion. We do not seek to impose our own hierarchy in place of yours. We seek only to establish a simple principle: that no species should be required to submit to another, that interaction between civilizations should be based on mutual benefit rather than forced integration, that Velthuri is not the only option.
You ask us to abandon everything we have built over 17,000 years.
We ask you to build something new, something better. Your knowledge, your technology, your organization, these things have value, but they have been used to suppress rather than uplift. We offer you the opportunity to redirect that potential toward cooperation rather than domination.
I watched the High Sovereign's face as she processed the situation. For 17,000 years, the Dominion had never faced a genuine peer, a force that could match us not through any single advantage, but through the simple accumulation of numbers, of allies, of the unified will of species who had been waiting for exactly this moment.
And if we refuse your offer? the High Sovereign asked. Then we will fight, and we will win, but many will die on both sides, and the galaxy will be diminished by the conflict. We would prefer to avoid that outcome. The question is whether your pride is worth more to you than the lives of your people.
It was a question that the Dominion had never been asked because no one had ever been in a position to ask it. The High Sovereign turned to look at me, and in her eyes I saw something I had never expected to see in those ancient depths: uncertainty.
Arbiter, she said quietly, so that only I could hear, you warned us. You told us what humanity was capable of, and we did not listen.
With respect, High Sovereign, I did not truly understand either. I knew they were preparing. I did not know they were preparing to change everything.
What would you do in my position? I considered the question carefully. I would accept their offer. Not because submission is acceptable, it never is, but because what they offer is not submission. They offer change, evolution, the opportunity to become something new while preserving what is valuable in what we have been. And if that evolution destroys us, then we will be destroyed as something other than what we were. But if we fight, High Sovereign, if we choose conflict over adaptation, we will be destroyed as exactly what we have always been, tyrants who could not conceive of any other way to exist. The High Sovereign was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. Open a channel to their fleet, Admiral.
The negotiations that followed lasted 3 years, a blink of an eye by Dominion standards, but an eternity by the standards of galactic politics. The framework that emerged was something unprecedented in the history of any species we had ever encountered, a genuine confederation of equals where no species held formal authority over any other, where disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than force, where the Velthari was formally abolished as a concept.
I was assigned to the Transitional Council as one of the Dominion's representatives, and it was there that I finally met Admiral Chen, the human who had first demonstrated what preparation truly meant.
He was older than I expected, his hair gray, his face lined with decades of responsibility. But his eyes carried that same quality I had seen in every human I encountered, a watchfulness that suggested constant evaluation, constant preparation, constant readiness for threats that might never materialize.
Arbiter Catherine Vor, he said, extending his hand in the human gesture of greeting. I've read your analyses. You understood us better than almost anyone in the Dominion. Not well enough, Admiral. I failed to anticipate the alliance you would build. He smiled, a peculiar expression that humans use to convey a range of emotions. That's because the alliance wasn't built through analysis. It was built through conversation, through empathy, through recognizing that other species were suffering under the same system that threatened us and offering them an alternative. You were preparing to resist us before you even knew we existed. We were preparing to resist anyone who demanded our submission. You were simply the first to actually make that demand. He paused, his expression becoming more serious. Can I ask you something, Arbiter? Of course. When you first learned about humanity, before we rejected your integration, what did you think of us? I considered the question honestly. I thought you were an interesting anomaly, more advanced than your development timelines suggested, but still fundamentally manageable. I expected the Velthari to apply, as it always had. And now? I understand that the Velthari was never a universal truth. It was simply a pattern that held for species who had not prepared for its application. You prepared. You spent your entire existence preparing. When we arrived and demanded submission, you had already been working on the response for generations." Admiral Chen nodded slowly. "Our history taught us that someone would always try to rule us, that there would always be an empire, a system, a power that believed it had the right to demand our obedience. We learned to resist that demand before it ever came, because once the demand arrives, it's often too late to build the capacity for refusal."
You turned paranoia into survival. We turned history into preparation. Every war we fought among ourselves, every tyrant we overthrew, every crisis we survived, they all taught us the same lesson, that submission is a choice and that the alternative to submission is readiness. We chose readiness.
Even when it seemed irrational? Even when no threat was visible?
Especially then, because the threats that seem invisible are often the ones that have already arrived. They've simply hidden themselves well enough that you don't recognize them until it's too late. He smiled again, but this time there was something almost gentle in the expression. The Dominion wasn't evil, Arbiter. You genuinely believed that Velthuri was a gift, a mercy, the best possible outcome for the species you integrated. But you were wrong.
And because you never faced a species that could refuse you, you never had the opportunity to learn that you were wrong.
Until humanity. Until humanity. And the 17 species who chose to stand with us rather than continue to accept their place in your hierarchy. He leaned forward slightly. We didn't defeat the Dominion, Arbiter. We gave it a choice it had never had before. You could have fought. You could have thrown everything you had at us and made the galaxy bleed. Instead, you chose to change. That took more courage than any battle would have required. I considered his words. In the years since the confrontation, I had spent considerable time reflecting on what had happened, not just the military defeat, but the philosophical collapse that had preceded it. The Dominion had believed that Velthuri was inevitable because we had never encountered a species capable of refusing it. We had mistaken a pattern for a law, a tendency for a truth. "Admiral," I said slowly, "there is something I have never understood about your species. When you first rejected our integration, you could have simply hidden. You could have built your fleet and your alliances in complete secrecy, waiting until you were absolutely certain of victory before revealing yourselves. Instead, you announced your refusal openly, knowing that it would provoke us. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because hiding wouldn't have accomplished what we actually wanted. We didn't want to destroy the Dominion. We wanted to change it. And you can't change a system by defeating it from outside. You can only change it by showing it a better alternative."
You risked your entire species on the possibility that we would choose differently.
We prepared for the possibility that you wouldn't, but we hoped for the outcome we actually got. He met my gaze directly. That's what preparation really means, Arbiter. It's not just about being ready for the worst. It's about being ready to act when the best becomes possible. We prepared for war. We hoped for peace. We got both. War that demonstrated the futility of conflict, and peace that emerged from understanding. In the decades since that conversation, I have watched the new order take shape. It is not what the Dominion was. There is no hierarchy, no Velthuri, no assumption that any species has the right to rule another. But it is also not chaos. Humanity's gift to the galaxy was not just military strength, but something more fundamental, a model for how cooperation could work without domination. They did not impose their system on anyone. They simply demonstrated that it worked and allowed others to choose whether to adopt it. Species that had known nothing but the dominion's hierarchy for thousands of years gradually learned new patterns, not submission, but partnership, not velthuri, but what the humans called mutual respect.
I am old now, by any species' standards. I have seen the rise and fall of empires, the integration of countless civilizations, the transformation of the galaxy from a hierarchy into something that defies easy categorization. And as I look back on everything that has happened, I find myself returning again and again to the same realization.
We demanded submission. We believed, with 17,000 years of evidence behind us, that submission was the natural response to overwhelming force. We had never encountered a species that responded differently, because we had never encountered a species that had spent its entire existence preparing for the moment when someone would make that demand.
Humanity did not defeat us through superior technology or greater numbers. They defeated us through something far more profound: the simple refusal to accept any demand for submission, combined with the systematic development of the means to make that refusal meaningful. They prepared, not just for us, but for anyone who might ever try to rule them. They prepared so thoroughly, so comprehensively, that by the time we arrived with our fleets and our philosophy, the outcome was already determined. We demanded submission. Humanity prepared.
And in that preparation, in the quiet, systematic, unhurried development of the capacity to refuse, they changed everything. I think now of the young humans I meet in the council chambers, the ones who were born after the transformation, who have never known a galaxy ruled by the Dominion's hierarchy. They carry themselves differently than their elders, with less of that constant watchfulness, that perpetual readiness for threats. They have the luxury of growing up in a galaxy where no one demands their submission.
But when I look closely, I see the preparation still there, buried beneath the surface. It is in their education systems, which emphasize adaptability and self-reliance. It is in their cultural narratives, which celebrate those who refuse to bend to tyranny. It is in their institutions, which distribute power so widely that no single point of failure can bring them down.
They are still preparing. They will always be preparing, because they understand something that the Dominion never grasped in 17,000 years of dominance, that the price of freedom is eternal readiness, and that the moment you stop preparing for threats is the moment you become vulnerable to them.
We demanded submission, expecting the response we had always received.
Humanity gave us something else entirely. They gave us a species that had been preparing for us since before we knew they existed. They gave us the first genuine challenge to our assumptions in 17 millennia. They gave us the opportunity to become something other than what we had been. And they did it not through force alone, but through the patient, systematic, unshakable certainty that submission was never an option, and that the only response to demands for submission was preparation for refusal.
They demanded submission. Humanity prepared.
And in that preparation, they proved that the velthuri was never inevitable. It was simply unchallenged, until a species came along that had been preparing to challenge it from the very beginning of their existence.
That is humanity's legacy. Not conquest, not domination, not the imposition of their own hierarchy in place of ours. Simply this: the demonstration that when someone demands your submission, the correct response is not despair, not acceptance, not the weary resignation of those who see no alternative. The correct response is preparation, and humanity had been preparing for longer than anyone could have imagined.